A mother is accused of doing the unthinkable to her own young daughter.
It's very disturbing. I mean, there's no greater obligation you have in the world to protect than to protect your child.
33-year-old Brandi Elliott is behind bars in Tennessee in connection with the death of her 7-year-old daughter, Piper. The case unfolded last week when the Hendersonville Police Department received a report of a child who had drowned at a local creek. An investigation would ultimately determine the 7-year-old's mother was allegedly responsible for the crime.
So, a lot of people will label these individuals as monsters, but these are shockingly ordinary people who are doing horrific things. A lot of them are people that have very poor coping skills. They may have a personality disorder. They have poor impulse control. You might be surprised to know that up to 40% of first time mothers who leave the hospital have thoughts about killing their children. Now, there's a difference between having thoughts and acting on those thoughts. So that's really what we're talking about here. Someone who was unable to cope and had very poor impulse control.
But Brandi's police interview would reveal more into the shocking crime. During her interview with investigators, Brandi explained she wanted alone time after having a rough day. She reportedly told officers she left her apartment and went to the bottom of the stairwell. However, Piper wanted to join her. Brandi said Piper refused to leave her alone and didn't want to stay at the apartment by herself. Investigators say Brandi then took her young daughter to a greenway across the street. And that's where she committed the horrific crime. Brandi told police she took her daughter to a shallow area off the greenway, and that's where she held her own daughter underwater while still telling her to be quiet. As she would tell investigators, she held her daughter underwater like a largemouth bass until she felt her bubbling.
There's no greater obligation than protecting your child, but this is someone who clearly was overwhelmed, was very emotionally immature, had very poor impulse control, and just couldn't handle it. And she thought at that particular second that maybe that was her only way out. And obviously now she's in a lot of trouble. And, there's at least two lives that have been ruined, if not many more.
Once Brandi pulled her daughter from the water, she reportedly realized she had done something wrong and tried to revive Piper with CPR.
Well, it reminds me of what I tell patients in my office who are suicidal. They'll commit these acts, and I tell them, if you jump off a building, you can't change your mind on the way down. So these acts of impulsivity, there's a point where when you push it too far, you sort of can't take it back. And maybe at that second, after her child lost consciousness and stopped breathing, she had that realization and she tried to quote unquote take it back. But by then it was too late. So she very well might be telling the truth.
Dr. Daniel Bober is a forensic psychiatrist. He explains the case is very similar to other high-profile stories of mothers who have killed their children by drowning.
What went through my mind are actually some other famous high-profile cases involving child murder. Susan Smith and Andrea Yates. In the case of Susan Smith, her defense team said that she had a psychotic break, but the prosecution contended that she did it to be with a lover who didn't want children. In the case of Andrea Yates, we're talking about postpartum psychosis, where she also drowned her children. But it's interesting. Child murder, which is labeled filicide, in the United States, we have the highest rate of child murder of any developed nation. And there are many different reasons that parents kill their children. Very often, it's they don't want the child, right? That's the most common reason. Another reason is that sometimes it's part of a suicide where the parent will intend to kill the child and then take their own life. And sometimes it can be for a psychotic or delusional reason that the parent believes the child is going to hell and they have to kill them before they go to hell, which is actually what happened in the Andrea Yates case. But the typical psychological profile of filicide, or a mother who kills her child, is usually a young mother who is single, who doesn't have a college education and has a history of poor or absent prenatal care.
7-year-old Piper was rushed to a local hospital where she was pronounced dead. Authorities charged her mother with first-degree murder. During a hearing last week, Brandi appeared before the judge, giving more insight into her state of mind. According to WKRN, Brandi said before the court, "When my daughter was 2, I kind of lost it like I did this time. I had postpartum depression, and they gave me medicine for it. I was having a really bad time sleeping."
And, being a parent is a very hard job, especially for a new mom. There's a lot of pressure that society puts on you. There's a lot of expectations, and I would say that it can be one of the hardest jobs in the world. And if you are not someone who has the mental wherewithal or the proper support to do that, some people can break under that stress. About 1 or 2 people out of every 10 people experience what we call the blues after pregnancy because of hormonal changes. And then probably about 1 in 100 experience postpartum depression, which is a form of depression that can result in feelings of hopelessness, poor appetite, poor sleep, lack of motivation, and even suicidal thoughts. And then for about 1 in 1,000 people, there's something called postpartum psychosis. And this is what Andrea Yates suffered from, where she was having full on paranoid delusions, which we believe impacted her behavior and led to the deaths of her 5 children. So, postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, these are not uncommon phenomenons, and they definitely affect women and their ability to care for their child, and sometimes can even put their child at risk of death.
But Dr. Bober says since Piper was older, it's possible Brandi could have been suffering from another mental health disorder.
So this would be a little bit long for it to still be from the effects of postpartum depression. But I will tell you this, there's a lot of people that believe that women who suffer from postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis have an underlying mood disorder. So it's possible that Brandi may have suffered from a mood disorder for many years. We don't know to what extent she was getting treatment for it, if she was on medication, but it's possible that what she's saying is true.
And here's what else we've learned about Brandi Elliott. She had no prior criminal record and was working at McDonald's. Photos on social media show several pictures of Brandi and her daughter Piper.
It doesn't fit, right? You would think a loving, doting mother would not do something like this to their child. You would think that they would, put their life on the line to protect their child. But to me, what that says is she may have very well loved her child, but in her own way, she was emotionally unstable and impulsive and did something that was horrific. And it does not necessarily mean she didn't love her child. It just may have meant at that particular split second that she wasn't thinking it through and she was acting on impulse.
During last week's court appearance, Brandi began crying as she told the judge she also helped care for her husband, who was living with a disability. After Piper's death, a GoFundMe page was created by a family friend of Piper's dad, John Elliott, which also shared more insight into the day of the murder. According to the description, Piper's father and Brandi's husband, who is a disabled military veteran, was hospitalized about a week prior to Piper's death. On the day of the murder, Brandi and Piper made a visit to John, and Piper even brought her dad coloring book pictures to hang up on the wall of his hospital room. But unknowing to John at the time, it would be the last time he saw his daughter alive, because just hours after the visit, she was killed.
We want to label this individual as a monster, but these are shockingly ordinary people who do horrible things. And all of us, to some degree, are capable of criminal behavior if we're pushed far enough. And that was her breaking point. Maybe having a husband who was disabled was just too much to bear. It was too much on her plate. And that is what pushed her over the top. You would be surprised. I see people every day who are very ordinary people. These are our friends, our neighbors, people we would meet out at a bar or at a restaurant, and they do horrific things, but sometimes they're just ordinary people who are pushed too far. And I think to some degree, most of us have the capacity to commit acts like this if we're pushed to the breaking point.
Since Brandi Elliott faces a first-degree murder charge, it's possible the state could seek the death penalty in the case. However, prosecutors reportedly weren't sure if they would seek the ultimate punishment. It's also been reported while Brandi was under the care of a mental health professional in the past, she currently isn't, and her attorney declined for her to be placed under a mental health evaluation. Dr. Bober says it's possible her attorney might try to find their own expert.
I was very puzzled by that. I'm wondering if it's because they want to get their own expert. I'm wondering if it has something to do with the type of housing that she would be put in. But I did find that very curious. I would think that with a criminal defendant like that, I would want to bring in my own expert to evaluate her because for sure the state is probably going to get their expert as well.
While Brandi remains locked up in jail, a memorial to her daughter Piper is now set up at the very place where she was killed.
I think we're going to see this, time and time again. It's not a unique situation. I think it's something that occurs when people become overwhelmed, when they're not mentally prepared to have a child. The old statement is, you need a license to get married, but you don't need a license to be a parent. And so a lot of parents are thrust into these situations that they're just not emotionally prepared to deal with. And to me, this just seems like a woman who wasn't evil, but she was just overwhelmed, had too much on her plate, wasn't able to cope, and committed a horrific act. If someone is watching this and they're overwhelmed and they're a single parent, I would ask them to try to reach out for help anywhere they can. And sometimes that might just be through their primary care physician, where they can say that they feel overwhelmed and they need help and they need referral to counseling, to not let it get to this point if you feel like you're having difficulty coping. And thoughts do not equal action. You may have a thought in your head to do something, but that doesn't have to turn into an action, and there's still time to intervene before something horrific happens.
Brandi Elliott remains behind bars, held on no bond. Her next scheduled court appearance is slated for August 14th. According to the GoFundMe page, Piper will be laid to rest on Wednesday, July 31st. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.